The old pagan priest watched, his heart heavy with foreboding, as the Christian church rose stone by stone on the outskirts of Nicomedia. For nearly 2 decades, the followers of the strange Jewish Messiah had been left in peace by the great Emperor Diocletian to spread their upstart faith across the empire. How foolish Diocletian had been, the priest thought bitterly, to allow this cancer to metastasize unchecked. Now the imperial tetrarchy Diocletian had established to restore order and revive the ancestral gods was fracturing, even as the Christians grew in numbers and influence with each passing year. Still, the old priest took some solace in the knowledge that not all in the imperial court had been blinded by the sly words and serpentine charm of the Christians. Galerius, Diocletian's vigorous and clear-eyed Caesar, had long argued for the need to take decisive action against this alien sect before it was too late. And now, with news spreading of Christian officers refusing to make the traditional sacrifices to the legionary standards, even Diocletian's resolve seemed to be hardening at last. Striding to the ancient shrine of Apollo that had stood sentinel over Nicomedia for centuries, the priest entered the shadowy interior, thick with the sweet smell of incense. Kneeling before the great statue of the sun god, he prayed fervently that the emperors would soon loose the avenging sword against the Christian menace. For a time, a blessed sense of peace and certainty washed over him as he communed with the divine. Apollo would not abandon his people in their hour of need. Miles away, in the imperial palace, Diocletian brooded. The years felt heavy upon him now, and the golden promise of his reign had given way to a deep unease. Unrolling a parchment, he read yet again the unsettling words a seer of Apollo had spoken when consulted on the matter of the Christians. The presence of the just upon the earth hindered Apollo from speaking truth, the oracle had declared, and this was why false prophecies issued from his tripods. There could be no doubt that by the just, the god referred to the Christians. Diocletian sighed. How had it come to this? He had only ever sought to be a wise and tolerant ruler, to restore the glory and stability of Rome after a generation of chaos. Yet now it seemed the gods themselves were demanding he spill the blood of his own people to preserve the empire. The burden of purple had never felt so oppressive. A faint shuffling of feet behind him caused Diocletian to turn. It was Galerius, his expression grave but determined. "My lord," the Caesar said, bowing his head respectfully, "I beg you, delay no longer. The Christians grow bolder by the day, undermining the foundations of our state, our faith, our very way of life. You must act now, while there is still time to turn back the tide. Let the world see that the gods of Rome yet reign supreme." Diocletian was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then slowly, heavily, he nodded. "You speak truth, my friend. I have been too tolerant, and our enemies have mistaken mercy for weakness. But no more. By my order, the Christian scriptures shall be seized and burned. Their churches shall be razed to the ground, their leaders arrested. We shall scour this foreign pollution from Roman soil." Galerius smiled thinly. At last, the scouring would begin. When word of the emperor's decree reached the great cities of the East, many Christians reacted with disbelief, then horror. For so long they had worshipped freely, steadily drawing converts from the decaying pagan cults. The abrupt end to imperial tolerance struck like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. In the grand church of Nicomedia, the bishop Anthimus paced anxiously, his mind awhirl. How could this be happening? Surely God would not abandon his faithful to the depredations of the pagans. Anthimus tried to take comfort in the protection of the Almighty, but icy tendrils of fear clutched at his heart. When the imperial soldiers burst through the doors of the church, their faces hard and swords already slick with Christian blood, that fear turned to blind panic. Anthimus tried to flee but found himself paralyzed, unable to will his trembling legs to move. As the soldiers seized him roughly, the last thing the bishop saw was a blazing torch sailing through the air to land upon the altar, the hungry flames quickly spreading to engulf the sanctuary. Across the empire, the next months unfolded in a nightmare of violence and terror for the Christians. Bishops and priests were dragged from their churches in chains. Scriptures and holy vessels were heaped upon bonfires. Judges and magistrates took cruel delight in forcing the faithful to abjure their impotent God and sacrifice to the idols of the state. The screams of the recalcitrant under torture haunted the dreams of those Christians who sought tenuous safety in silence and hiding. Yet, as the brutality of the persecution mounted, so too did the defiance and fervor of many believers. In Carthage, the unbowed faithful met in secret to defy the emperor's order, even as their bishop languished in chains. In Rome, the martyr Anastasia spat in the face of the governor as she was led to her death in the arena, declaring that Christ alone was her eternal king. And in far-off Gaul, beyond the authority of Diocletian and Galerius, whispered tales spread of the mercy and tolerance of Constantius, the Caesar of the West, giving hope to those who despaired. But it was in Palestine, in the hilltop town of Caesarea, that the persecutions reached their savage zenith. There, the Caesar Maximandea, a man of animal cruelty hidden behind a veneer of cultured piety, unleashed a storm of blood and fire upon the Christians. Elders were burned alive, maidens abused, children dashed against stones. The gutters ran red, and the wails of the dying mingled with the triumphant laughter of the mob. Through it all, one man, Pamphilus the teacher, became a beacon of courage. Learned in the classics and philosophy, Pamphilus had always dreamed of the day when pagan wisdom and Christian truth would be reconciled. Now, as he huddled in a fetid cell, his body broken by the torturer's irons, those fond hopes seemed a bitter jest. Yet even as the end drew near, Pamphilus refused to recant his faith. Dragged before the governor, a man he had once called a friend, Pamphilus endured the final mockery of his tormentors. "How can you still cling to your feeble God?" sneered the governor. "Your Christ has abandoned you, just as he abandoned Judea to Rome's might. Only by embracing the true gods can you yet be saved." Pamphilus raised his head, blood-rimmed eyes bright with unshakable conviction. "My God will never abandon me. It is you who are forsaken, you who revel in lies and murder. Do your worst, my death will only strengthen my brothers. The church will endure. The truth of Christ is coming into the world, and you cannot stop it." The governor's face twisted.
So die in your delusion.
He flicked his hand, and the blade fell. Mile upon mile away, a young man tossed fitfully in his sleep. Constantine, the son of Constantius, the untested heir to an empire in turmoil. Visions troubled his dreams. Armies clashing under an alien sky, the screams of the dying, a heavenly voice whispering words he could not quite make out. Constantine jerked awake with a gasp, his heart racing. Sitting up on the edge of his camp bed, he tried to clear his mind, to banish the night terrors. But as he did, a sudden conviction seized him with the force of revelation. Something was coming. Some great decision loomed before him, upon which hinged the fate of the empire, the world. But what did these omens portend? Across the empire, the seasons turned, and the years ground on. Galerius, once so hale and strong, was ravaged by a terrible sickness, his body eaten away even as he ate away at the church. Diocletian, weary of rule and heartsick at the rivers of blood, withdrew to the gardens of his Dalmatian palace, leaving the reins of power to other hands. In Africa, a schism erupted, the Donatists denouncing as apostates any who had buckled before imperial terror. And in the East, Maximin's iron fist closed ever tighter around the Christians. But beneath the surface, a current was gathering force, a wind of change rustling the leaves of destiny. Constantine, his star ever rising in the West, began to eye the aging tetrarchs with the cool calculation of a born survivor. An uncanny sense told him that the old order was doomed, that the future belonged to the man bold enough to seize it. But to seize it in the name of what? The gods of his fathers? Or the God of the Christians? Torn by indecision, haunted by visions he could not understand, Constantine played a waiting game, gathering his strength, his purpose. When Galerius, wasted and raving, grudgingly issued an edict of toleration on his deathbed, Constantine saw the first crack in the pagan edifice. When riots erupted in Rome against the cruel and capricious rule of Maxentius, he knew his moment was at hand. Marching on the Tiber, Constantine cast the die, staking all on a battle for supremacy, for the right to shape the future. But on the eve of the clash, as his army made camp, a wonder appeared in the darkening sky above, a cross of stars shimmering with unearthly radiance. And from everywhere and nowhere, a mighty voice spoke, "In this sign you shall conquer." In that moment, the fog of doubt and confusion fell away. Constantine saw his destiny as clear as a shaft of celestial light. The Christian God had chosen him as his instrument to forge a new world from the ruins of the old. Pagan and Christian, Greek and Latin, Rome and its dominions, all would be united under the banner of the cross. The battle was brief and bloody. Maxentius, disdaining to retreat to Rome's stout walls, instead staked all on one desperate gambit to crush the usurper. But the legions of Constantine were filled with a holy fury, their swords and shields blazoned with the Chiro emblem of Christ. The forces of the old gods broke and fled before this terrifying new power, and Maxentius himself met his end tangled in his own imperial purple, drowned in the turbid waters of the Tiber. Constantine entered the eternal city in triumph, hailed as the deliverer of Senate and people. A new age had dawned, an age of transformation. In the east, Licinius decisively bested Maximin, the last champion of the dying pagan cause. Meeting Constantine in Milan, the two Augusti thrashed out the terms of an empire reborn. The persecutions were over. The church was now to have the full protection of the state. "Your sufferings have ended," Constantine told the assembled bishops. "Too long have you lived in fear in the shadows. Now you shall take your rightful place in the light." The bishops, men broken and scarred by the horrors of the past decade, wept with joy and relief. The great persecution was over. The last terrible trial had been endured. The church had survived. Against all odds, against all earthly power, the faith had prevailed. The blood of the martyrs had been the seed of its victory. One final challenge remained. In the east, Licinius began to fall away from the new order, flirting with the old ways, the prescribed cults. Whispers spread that he planned to repudiate the Edict of Milan, to once more light the fires of oppression. Constantine heard these whispers, and his eyes grew cold with anger. He had not fought so long and so hard to see the bad old days return. There could be only one vision for the empire now, one God, one truth. And he would be its champion, its master. The war, when it came, was a reckoning long overdue. At Adrianople and Chrysopolis, the armies of the cross annihilated the forces of reaction. Licinius, once hailed as a liberator, ended his days a reviled captive, his name expunged from the imperial records. An empire divided against itself could not stand. In the long years that followed, as Constantine tightened his grip on sole power, the old world order fell away like the last dead leaves of autumn. Across the empire, temples were razed or repurposed as churches. Pagan festivals were abolished, their tombs replaced by solemn Christian ritual. The emperor lavished gold and glory on the church, making it a power in the land, even as he worked slyly to tame it to his will. Many rejoiced at Christianity's triumph. The promise of the one true God, of salvation and eternal life through Christ, was balm to weary spirits in a world too long mired in blood and sorrow. But others watched the rising tide with growing unease. Had the Galileans truly conquered through faith alone? Or had they merely traded one master for another? The martyrs rotting in their shrouds seemed to whisper that the church had bargained away its soul, made a devil's pact with the very power that had sought to destroy it. The aging bishop of Nicomedia, Eusebius, struggled with such doubts as he put quill to parchment, seeking to make sense of all that had happened. An image came to him unbidden of two great armored juggernauts, Roman and Christian, hurtling toward each other out of the mists of history, fated for a cataclysmic collision. But in his mind's eye, at the moment of impact, the two merged into one, their outlines blurring, their substance fusing together into a whole mightier than either alone. Was that not the truth of this new age Constantine had wrought? A union of sacred and profane, spirit and state, to bring the law of heaven down to earth, to make the kingdom of God an empire without end, Was this not the great task for which the church had been forged and tested in the fires of persecution? Eusebius wavered, the full import of that journey stretching out before him in all its terrible majesty. Then he bent to his work once more. The sun was setting in the Forum, shadows lengthening across the gleaming marble monuments of a reborn Rome. The old pagan priest emerged slowly from the doorway of a rundown insula, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. His eyes rheumy with age gazed out at a city, a world, he barely recognized anymore. Everywhere the cross and the Chiro, daubed on walls, stitched on vestments, worked in bronze and gold. The sign of the Galileans arrogant in their victory. But what kind of victory in the end? You have won an empire, the priest whispered. But will it corrupt you even as you corrupt it? In striving to conquer the world, have you lost your own soul? No one marked the old man's words or his passage. He disappeared into the labyrinthine alleys, a ghost from a vanished age, fading into the darkness of history. Above the 7 hills of the eternal city, the first stars glittered to life in a heaven no longer haunted by the gods of old, bright as the dreams and ambitions of the new rulers of the world.